It's been almost 10 years now since Malaysian Flight 370 went down. And we still don't know the definitive answer as to why, but we have aviation journalist Jeff Wise on, who has been investigating this for a good long time and is an expert on the flight. Also has a podcast coming up soon on the subject. Episode 1 is How to Approach an Unsolved Mystery. That's Deep Dive MH370. Looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's already up, the pilot episode there.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right. So, Jeff, what happened like a few months later? I think MH370 went down in March, right? Was it March 8th?
Yep.
And then in July of that year, another Malaysian flight goes down. This one is shot down by the Russians over Ukraine. And then people started making connections there between the two, thinking, well, maybe that's what happened to Malaysian 370, just not necessarily the Russians, but somebody else shot it down.
Not really. Actually, for a long time, everyone very quickly assumed that it had to be a mistake.
Oh.
No, I though didn't because remember I had said that I had started to wonder if this box was turned on because somebody wanted to leave a trail of electronic breadcrumbs and took the plane north rather than south, then that would mean that the plane actually went to Kazakhstan. And actually wound up pretty close to a piece of Russian territory that the Kazakhs leased to Russia, which they use to launch all their rockets into space. And for a long time, they were actually launching Americans into space because we didn't have a space program.
We were hitchhiking.
Right. And so if that was my sort of the only explanation. So I said, look, if this was tampered with, then you're not going to find the plane on the seabed. Of course, the seabed search hadn't even started at that point. And it sounded pretty crazy to people, and people got mad at me for suggesting this, but the idea was that maybe Russians took this plane. And I remember I said that like you would have to be insanely sophisticated to pull this off. But it turns out that the things that you would have to do to this plane are things that people in the field of electronic warfare do all the time in terms of air defense. You know, you send out a drone and it's sending out a signal that confuses the air defense. That's basically what this idea is about. And so I had already started to hire people. I had hired researchers in Russia and Ukraine to start to look into the 3 Russian passengers on board the plane, 2 of which were sitting right under the satellite data unit. And one of which was sitting near the hatch to the electronics compartment. So I had hired investigators to look into this. And then on the morning of July 17th, I got a telephone call from a booker at CNN. Said, "Hey, did you hear about the Malaysian Airlines 777 in Ukraine?" And I was like, "You mean in Malaysia?" Because I was already thinking about Ukraine. And they were like, "No, it was a different Malaysian Airlines 777." And I was like, that is not a coincidence. I mean, Malaysian Airlines 777 connected to Ukraine. I mean, because all this, the Russia was in the process of annexing Crimea at this point. And I was like, oh, that's it. Like, that's the end of the story. Like, clearly these things are related. But I wound up going on CNN and looking at this footage, and I didn't want to seem crazy at the time. And I didn't have any real evidence. And I hadn't really started to develop my thinking about it at this point. So everyone's like, oh, this is clearly just a weird coincidence. And I'm like, yeah, it looks like a coincidence. It wasn't until, and so what happened was this guy named Igor Strelkin, who was basically an officer of the GRU, the Russian military intelligence. And he put out a blog post saying, hey, we shot down this Ukrainian military plane. Hey, hooray for us. And everyone was like, oh, no, you didn't, because it wasn't a Ukrainian military plane. It was really a Malaysian Airlines 777. And so they thought that that was a mistake. Like, who would intentionally make a mistake like that? Well, the kind of person who would make an intentional mistake like that is Russian military intelligence, because they're constantly, engaged in what we call hybrid warfare, right? They're constantly putting out misinformation. And so it wasn't until more like a year later that this group called Bellingcat, based in the UK, but really involving volunteers all around the world, they put together this data that they found on social media, using this technique that they'd started using in Syria. It's now very common, OSINT, open source intelligence. It's really common now, but at the time was really groundbreaking. And they were able to show that, no, this wasn't a mistake by some by some untrained militiamen who happened somehow to get their hands on a captured, like, Ukrainian anti-aircraft missile system. No, this was actually an operation run by the GRU, the same military organization that employed Igor Girkin. Igor Girkin, parenthetically, last week got arrested by the Russians because he was too closely connected to Prigozhin. So it's all a big mess. But the Russians are like definitely involved. The military intelligence shot down MH17. Like, we know that now. It really at the time nobody could believe it.
Wow. And why? So, but what is the motivation to shoot down the Malaysian plane in Ukraine? Why would they do that?
Why? Why did they do that? Exactly. This is a case what I was talking about before.
Yeah.
You know what happened, and you know who did it. You don't know why.
Right.
You can't start with motive.
Okay.
People do things, and especially, in the context of one of the aspects of hybrid warfare, when you're, and this is like a standard, this is not a new invention. People have been trying to mess with each other's heads since the dawn of time. Mm-hmm. You don't just defeat your enemy with swords and cannons. You convince them that they're going to lose. Military theorists have been talking about this forever. And so part of the effort of confusion is like, if your enemy doesn't know what's happening or why, that's good. So the whole thing, one thing that did result from MH17 getting shot down is that the airspace over Ukraine was closed. The Ukrainians stopped using attack aircraft, which had been very successful. It kind of was militarily very significant for the Russians because they were losing the civil war that was unfolding in the Donbass at that time.
Interesting. Wow. Okay, so do you believe the theory of the three Russians being involved in MH370 then?
I think this is a really important point to make, which is that the goal is not to believe. The goal is to try to understand what data can be, what data is useful, what data is plausible, and try to find out what stories are comport with that evidence.
We want to believe, Jeff. We want to believe.
I know. We all do. And listen, so basically the point that I try to make is like there's two theories that have any relation whatsoever to the data that we have at hand. One is that the pilot did it, and one is that the Russians took it. Both of them have problems. Mm-hmm. And I personally feel that the pilot one has more problems than the Russian one.
Okay.
Wow.
Okay.
And you don't concern yourself with why they did it, right? You just
I have a whole chapter in my book explaining the sort of geopolitical context.
Okay.
And I will say this, that when I started to suspect the Russians, I got kind of terrified because the implication was that the Russians were engaged in a very sophisticated and very aggressive and very ruthless attack.
Yeah.
Aimed at like we don't know what exactly, but sort of vaguely against the West. At the time, the world was condemning the Russian annexation of Crimea. Russia was engaged in basically the first military invasion since World War II of a neighboring European country. I think of Serbia. That might be wrong, but anyway, the point is. There was a war, a sort of a war had started. The West tended to think of it as a localized conflict involving Ukraine and Russia, but I think Russia saw it as a worldwide conflict. It needed to push back NATO. Mm-hmm. To Russia, the Ukraine was a red line.
And we kind of see that now.
Yes, we do.
And so basically, the point I was making was like, I got very afraid that if MH370 was carried out by the people I thought might have carried it out, then that meant that all this bad stuff was going to happen. And all that bad stuff did happen.
Yeah.
Like Russia really did engage in a sophisticated and aggressive and ruthless campaign, multidimensional. It involved assassinating dissidents. It involved subverting elections and getting involved in all kinds of shenanigans, and sometimes in a very sophisticated way. There's an amazing documentary that came out about how the Russians carried out this doping scandal with the Olympics. Mm-hmm. And they basically figured out a way to tamper with these Swiss-made urine collection bottles that the Swiss are 100% convinced were untamperable with. You cannot tamper with them. And all the right-thinking people were like, it's impossible to tamper with it. And again, to me, it was like all these people who are saying, oh, it's impossible to tamper with this data. I'm like, you can't conceive of it because you think you're the smartest player. You can't conceive that your enemy is smarter than you. But that's what electronic warfare and that's what espionage is all about. It's about being smarter than the other guys. And I'll tell you, it's easy to think, oh, the Russians are drunk, their equipment is crap. Russians can carry out very, very sophisticated things. They were the ones who got to put a man in orbit for the first time. And don't minimize them. They're capable of doing very, very sophisticated things. One of the most dangerous things you can do in a conflict situation is underestimate your enemy.
I will say this though about the Russians: they paid dearly for the drugging scam.
Did they?
Oh yeah, they had to, instead of being called Russian athletes, they were called athletes from the Russian Federation.
Ouch!
Yeah, that hurt. And they had to do a different colored flag. So that taught them a severe lesson, I think, right there.
Yeah, it did. Jeff, I really dig the Russian theory. I do. My only hang-up there really is if they wanted to show this as an attack on the West and look at what we can do, why would they go after an Asian-based plane where, like 60% of the passengers are from China? I mean, that's kind of my only hang-up on that theory there. Again,
that's a great objection. And as I've said, like each theory has its weaknesses.
Yeah.
I do have an explanation. I do have a reason for why this particular plane was targeted, which is that if you think of it in terms of like information security or computer security, like basically what I'm proposing that this was hacked, that they found a vulnerability and they exploited it. And if you find a vulnerability, it might not apply to all machines, right? Like if you find a weakness in an iPhone, it might not apply to, a different manufacturer's phone. And so I found a specific vulnerability that existed with MH370. I could be proven wrong if someone steps forward and says, no, this part of it you're misinterpreting. But MH370 had about 5 or 6 characteristics that, because it had all of them, and very few planes do, it was vulnerable to like this kind of vanishing, where it looks like it's going into the deep ocean where nobody can see it. There's no radar coverage, no satellite is looking at it, and it's actually going north. Because remember, until the debris started turning up, the only evidence we had for this plane where it went was electronic and math.
Right.
And then I just want to quickly say that, the pieces of debris started washing up in the Indian Ocean, and the investigators got really excited because they're like, there's barnacles on these. Barnacles grow like trees. They have like rings on a tree. So you can tell how long it's been in the water and where it came from. So they're like, great, we're going to use these barnacles to tell us where the plane crashed, and then we're going to find the plane. Well, they looked at the barnacles. The barnacles had only been in the water for a month.
Oh wow!
And the debris had been the plane had been missing for 15 months.
Right.
Oh wow! Oh my gosh!
The plot thickens. Have
that's bizarre.
Right.
Does that bodes well to your theory, though?
It does.
So in the 10 years that the plane has been missing now, has there been any indication in any form whatsoever of any individuals from the plane or the plane itself being in Russian-held territory? Has there been any kind of indication, any rumors, anything like that?
We got any satellite footage of the plane in Kazakhstan?
No, we don't. If and I the idea is that like this was a super sophisticated operation, but like there's humans, and like did they leave a trace that you could find later? And I spent a lot of time investigating. I started to look at the Russian passenger, and then it got really hard to do research in Russia. It got kind of dangerous. He's a fascinating guy. He's in my book. I won't bore you right now, but he was a kind of like real MacGyver kind of character. His hobby was diving underneath the frozen ice of Lake Baikal in the winter.
A lot of us like that.
Yeah, I do that too.
He's a wild.
A lot of that.
He was a real interesting character, but I kind of lost track of him. There were these two Ukrainian men who were Soviet Army veterans who were sitting underneath the satellite data unit. And they supposedly worked for this furniture company, but nothing about it really. It doesn't really add up. Like why they were on this particular flight.
Wow.
It's sort of I don't really have anything definitive, frankly, but I'm continuing to work on it, and I don't know if I'll send or not.
Okay, so what's the name of your book?
The book is The Taking of MH370.
The Taking.
The Taking of MH370.
Which kind of gives you a clue as to where you headed.
Well, I do think that it was taken. I mean, whether it was taken by the pilot or by somebody else, Russians, for instance, it was taken. And I think that this idea that it was shot down by the Americans, that there was a fire on board or stuff. I think we can put those things aside. There's been a lot of documentaries made over the last 10 years, and I think that the tendency that the producers tend to follow is, there's 13 different conspiracy theories. Let's talk about them all. Let's give them equal weight. And I really think we should move beyond that.
Right.
I think I think we can assess what's valuable evidence and what's not.
I mean, this is one of the most, expensive searches in history, right? I mean, we've spent
lengthy
hundreds of millions of dollars and man hours and technology to find this plane, and we've come up with a wing part with barnacles that are on it for a month. Right. I know we found some other debris as well that washed up on shore. The one metal detector guy found quite a few items from the plane. At least they claim that it's from the plane. But it's really strange that we've spent all this time and money on, and we have not found anything. I mean, we found a couple of ships that crashed. That's it.
It's frustrating to me because, like I said, back before they even started to look for MH370, I said that look, there is a vulnerability that exists with this plane that could explain how it might not have gone south. So if you don't find it in the south, you just consider this other possibility.
Right.
And the authorities, who I think in every other respect have done a remarkable job. They carried out an incredibly complex and demanding task in searching an area the size of Great Britain, 3 miles deep, with underwater canyons and mountains and everything. Incredible, very impressive. But they have refused ever to entertain the possibility that this data could have been tampered with. Mm-hmm. They refuse to. They're like, it has to be there, and it's like, well, how could it possibly be there? You searched the area where you said it had to have gone, and it's not there. Like, what is your explanation? And I feel like it's too important. Even if I'm completely wrong in my theory,
to not do
look,
that.
This is a plane with 239 people aboard that vanished into thin air. Mm-hmm. That it's a hole in our understanding of airplanes.
Yeah.
And so you can't really get on a plane and say to yourself with 100% certainty that you're not going to vanish, because we don't know what happened to this one.
Right. Fascinating stuff. Jeff, thanks for all the hard work and research you've done on this. Fascinating stuff. We'll be watching out for in fact, the pilot episode of your podcast is already available. Where can people find that?
They can find that on the Apple Podcasts.
Okay.
Just search for Deep Dive MH370.
All right.
I still want to know why.
That's my point.
I want to know
this is
why.
fascinating, Jeff. Thank you so much, man.
This is really good.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it. You're not supposed to worry about the why.
I know.
Doesn't matter. So shut up about the why, would you? You're really pissing me off.